This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into the Dynasty Alchemist Podcast. This is Dustin Chandler. I'm recording on Friday evening, August 25th. And I'm intending to try and get a four-part series, four separate podcasts out by next weekend, before the Labor Day holiday, where a majority of your fantasy redrafts will occur. And the goal of this four-part series is kind of to go on the record with some targets and some fades in both Dynasty and Redraft. So, imagine on the horizontal line, you have fades, players you want to avoid, and on the other end, you have targets, players you want to either draft this year or acquire in Dynasty. And on the Y side, the vertical line, you have Redraft and you have Dynasty on each end, right? Redraft, single year. Dynasty, year over year. And then within each one of those four quadrants, we're going to have a set of players. So, for example, today, we're going to talk about the players you want to be targeting in both Dynasty and Redraft. These are going to be players that I think from a Redraft standpoint are going to outperform their ADP, and giving their age, their situation, their contract, what have you, because they're going to outperform their ADP, I think you're going to see a pretty sizable jump in their Dynasty value over the next 6 months. So this will be the focus of today's episode. The other parts of the series, obviously, will look at players you want to avoid in both Dynasty and Redraft, and then you'll have a combination of players that you want to target in Redraft but avoid in Dynasty, and vice versa, players that you would want to target long-term in Dynasty but are avoiding this year in Redraft. But let's take a look today at the players you want to be targeting in both Dynasty and Redraft. So I have 10 players in total that are going to be targets in both Dynasty and Redraft this year. That's going to be 2 quarterbacks, 4 wide receivers, 2 running backs, and 2 tight ends. So at quarterback, the 2 guys that I am absolutely targeting are right next to each other pretty consistently in ADP right now, and that's Anthony Richardson of the Colts, the rookie, at quarterback 14, Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks right behind him at quarterback 15. So let's first focus on Anthony Richardson, the rookie quarterback selected 4th overall during the last NFL draft by the Colts. Look, it's not hyperbole to say this is the most athletic prospect we have ever seen at this position. That's quantifiable by player profiles data, right? They have said by every available metric that we measure athleticism with, this guy is far and away the most athletic quarterback we have ever seen come out of college. And their comp for Anthony Richardson is Josh Allen of the Bills, who's become one of the top players in the league and one of the top fantasy assets. On top of that, the history of quarterbacks coming into the league who have this sort of rushing floor is still very, very favorable from a redraft standpoint. Like I said, Anthony Richardson's going, depending on if you're talking about a 10-team league or a 12-team league, he's going as a high to mid quarterback 2. You're pretty safe with an insulated floor. This guy's already been named the starter for week 1, right? You can look at Josh Allen's stats in his second year when he became the full-time starter, right? He passed for 3,000 yards, which is pretty close to what Anthony Richardson's passing prop is at right now. So he passed for 3,000 yards, 20 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. He had 500 rushing yards, and he had 9 rushing touchdowns. That put him at just short of 300 total points that season, which was 6th overall. Josh Allen was not very good from a passing standpoint, but when you add the rushing capability of 6 to 8 touchdowns, 500 to 700 rushing yards, and then you add in the 2,800 to 3,000 passing yards, and obviously he's going to get 15 to 20 passing touchdowns. at a floor. He may not be good on the field and help the Colts win this year, but because of the rushing, he's a fantasy asset, and he is a value at where he's currently going. And from a dynasty standpoint, he's already ranked as quarterback 9. And if you're talking about Superflex startup, did a few of those over the summer, pretty consistently in the early to mid second round from a startup standpoint. And look, like I said, the floor is very high with Richardson. He's going to be the starter again next year. That provides a lot of insulation to his value year to year, even if you don't quite like what you see from a passing standpoint, right? Take Justin Fields, for example. Wasn't a great passer last year, but because of the high floor on his rushing, he's still valued as a first-round startup quarterback in Superflex Dynasty. Right now, quarterback 8, and Richardson's right behind him at quarterback 9. So I think you're going to be pretty safe with Richardson as a target, because this guy is going to, at a minimum, retain his value of where he's going right now, and I think most likely he's going to continue to climb an appreciation in his value going into next year. And the second quarterback is clearly just Geno Smith. He was incredible last year, and he continues to be disrespected. Part of that is just because there is so much depth at the quarterback position, but I also think there's just a bias against Geno Smith, right? This was a guy who, I guess in a sense, busted when he came into the league as a second-round pick. He failed in New York. Then most people kind of thought of him as a journeyman backup. And then he has this career resurrection last year with Seattle, and he's named the starter. But he was really good last year. It wasn't just kind of a fluky result from a fantasy standpoint. He was a legitimate, high-quality quarterback. PFF ranked him as a top 10 quarterback, and from a fantasy standpoint, he was 5th overall in total points scored on the season last year, and he was 8th on a point-per-game basis. Again, this is a guy in Redraft who is, 15th overall right now in Redraft? I mean, that's crazy, crazy value right now. And while he is 15th in Redraft leagues, his current ranking within Dynasty right now is 21st. This is a guy who's still in his early 30s, just got a new 3-year contract. He has, I think, arguably one of the best supporting cast when you look at his wide receiver, tight end, running back group, right? He had a good team last year with Metcalf and Lockett and Walker, and now you add Charbonnet, you add JSN, who I absolutely love. You have Noah Fant, right? A young, developing offensive line. This offense only got better last year, and Geno Smith was already great. He's clearly undervalued right now in both Redraft and Dynasty. So from a Redraft standpoint, my strategy right now, and this would be typical 10, 12 team PPR leagues. At the quarterback position, I have 2 options. Option 1 is I can target an elite quarterback. I'm probably going to pass on Mahomes just because he goes so high and the position is so deep. But if I can get a player like Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, even Lamar Jackson at their current ADPs, I'm not going to reach for them, but if I can get one of those 3 guys at where they're currently valued, I would take them there. But if I miss on any of those, I'm targeting both Richardson and Geno Smith combined on the back end there to be one of the last ones to select my quarterback. And then if I were to miss on one and get the other, you can always maybe settle for a guy like Daniel Jones to kind of be your backup option. But then on the Dynasty side with Geno Smith, again, he's quarterback 21. If you're anywhere near contention and you have question marks about who your quarterback 2 is right now, he is an easy target, right? You can float a future first, and again, if you're contending, we're talking a late first for Geno Smith, and maybe you get something else back, maybe like Geno and a third for a first. So my first of 4 wide receivers that I am targeting in both Dynasty and Redraft, this is my favorite of the 4, is Tampa Bay wide receiver Chris Godwin. All this guy has done is produced year after year after year after year, and he is just criminally undervalued right now. He is wide receiver 25 right now in Redraft, and more criminally, he is wide receiver 31 in Dynasty rankings. And like I said, this guy has produced for the last 4 years. His season total He was wide receiver 2 in 2019 when he kind of exploded on the scene. He was 31st in 2020 in 12 games played. 2021, 16th overall. 2022, 19th overall. Now, he did miss a few games in there, but the games that he played, he was incredibly strong. If you look at points per game, his scoring those 4 seasons, 2nd, 15th, 7th, 18th. 4 straight years, he has been a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy points scored per game. And this is a guy who's drafted outside the top 20 in redraft and well outside the top 20. Again, he's outside the top 30 in Dynasty. And of course, the bias against Godwin, I guess it's kind of twofold. One, it's a little bit with his age. He's 27, and he's been around for a while. Obviously, the bigger one is going to be the fact that Baker Mayfield has been named the starter for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a clear downgrade from Tom Brady. With that being said, they don't have a lot of depth at the position. His target routes run, his target share, it's going to be incredibly high in this offense. He's going to be the alpha. He's 2 years now removed from the knee injury. On top of that, I think he has some positive touchdown regression coming his way. I mean, check this out. From 2019 to 2022, the last 4 seasons, his touchdown total starting in 2019, 9, 7, 5, and 3 last season. So even if the volume of pass attempts comes down in the Tampa offense, his target share is going to be high. His route participation is going to be high. He's likely to see positive touchdown regression. He is a clear undervalued player in ADP, one I am targeting, where he's currently going in redraft. And then from a dynasty standpoint, this is a guy who's, I think, is already the top wide receiver on his team, and I think is going to be the top wide receiver next year. When you think Mike Evans, 30 years old, last year of his contract, I'll be somewhat surprised if he returns to Tampa Bay next year in what I think will likely be a rebuilding scenario. And then they're going to have an upgraded quarterback. I don't think Baker Mayfield is going to be the long-term answer. There's very few who think he will be. But I think the Bucs will also be in a position where Chris Godwin could be the alpha, and your starting quarterback could be drafted as Caleb Williams or maybe Drake May, two elite prospects that are going to go very high, not only in the NFL draft, but in dynasty drafts as well. So Godwin's value is great right now at redraft, and I think he's going to continue to appreciate in value even next year when he turns 28 years old with the Bucs. Another player I'm really high on in both redraft and dynasty that actually goes a little bit below Godwin is Steelers wide receiver Diontae Johnson. In dynasty, these two are actually right next to one another. I have Godwin at wide receiver 31, Johnson at wide receiver 32. And then from a redraft standpoint, Johnson even goes about a round later than Godwin, currently late 5th, early 6th round as wide receiver 31. And all this guy does is command targets, right? The last 3 seasons, his target totals 144, 169, 147, right? He's averaging 150 targets a year. He's playing just about every single game. He's averaging about 1,000 yards. Obviously, I think we're all well aware of what happened last year and why he dropped so precipitously compared to his ADP, and the fact that he had 0 touchdowns. Right, his touchdown totals the last 4 seasons: 5, 7, 8, 0. Almost completely. It is unheard of. It's almost statistically improbable. I honestly think you could probably throw every single stat into a computer and ask it to look at the probabilities of Diontae Johnson and how many touchdowns it scored. It would run. You could ask it to run 1,000 simulations. I would be shocked if it came up with even one where he scored 0 touchdowns. It seems completely improbable. And he's not really a between the 20s sort of guy that I think a lot of people think that he is. I mean, if you take a look at, the 33rd team has a tool called The Edge. I'd highly recommend you should check it out. It's pretty cool. But I was looking at just red zone totals from last season across the league for all wide receivers. Deontay Johnson had 134 snaps, 18 targets. So from a target standpoint, he was tied for 14th overall for targets in the red zone. He had 7 receptions, so his catch rate was actually pretty poor. I think a lot of that had to do more with the inefficiency of the offense and having a rookie quarterback in Kenny Pickett. But you can also look at all these guys who are in the top 20 for red zone targets. Yeah, there's a few with 3, but pretty consistently you're somewhere between 4 to 8 receiving touchdowns on the season. And somehow Deontay Johnson, even with the high snap count, a reasonable target amount, 7 receptions, still somehow ended up with 0. It's just nuts to me that this is even possible. And then you can look at the advanced metrics as well. He was still the alpha in the red zone, and he still somehow scored 0 touchdowns, right? He had the largest target share of any Steelers last year in the red zone. He was at 28.6%, right? Over a quarter of the red zone targets went his way. It was significantly more than what George Pickens had. Deontay Johnson was at 28.6% target share for the Steelers last year in the red zone, significantly more than the rest of his teammates. Freiermuth was second at 22.4, and then you have to go down significantly to find George Pickens, who was only at 11.1% red zone target last year. And then if we want to look at more advanced metrics, played all 17 games. Again, this is all in the red zone. He had a high snap count in the red zone, a high target share, 28.6. His average depth of target, his ADOT, was reasonable at 7.9. His air yards, he was 8th in the league last year in air yards in the red zone at 150 yards. Again, it's completely improbable. Positive touchdown regression is coming to Deontay Johnson. He has had a great camp. He is the number 1 guy on this team. Kenny Pickett has looked great this preseason. Deontay Johnson is going to well outperform his ADP, and because of that, I think he's going to see a pretty significant bump in his dynasty value come this offseason. My third wide receiver target for both redraft and dynasty this year is Commanders' second-year wide receiver, Jahan Dotson. And I like Dotson even before the potential injury to Terry McLaurin occurred. We still don't officially know how long McLaurin will be out, but I suspect he might miss a week or 2 to start the season and might even be hampered through most of the season. So I think it is a safe bet right now that Dotson could assume the number 1 role in that offense, or at least have the highest fantasy output, if you will. Maybe not the number 1 role, but he will have the highest fantasy scoring ahead of McLaurin this upcoming season. Right now, Jahan Dotson's redraft ADP is middle of the 7th round. He is wide receiver 38, which is kind of crazy. And then from a dynasty standpoint, obviously being second-year wide receiver, first-round pick last year, he's going to rank a little bit higher, wide receiver 26 right now in dynasty is Dotson. Dotson last year came out of the gate really strong. His first 4 weeks, 18 points. Week 3, he had a stinker, 3 points. Week 4, 13 points. Then he got hurt, missed most of the middle of the year, and then came back strong from week 13 on. His point total 16, 20 and a half, 20, 7, and 10. And what's incredible is that he scored really well on what was actually a pretty limited route participation. I mean, in fact, that closing 5-week stretch where he scored about 15 points a game, he was only averaging about 30 routes a game. So you're going to see his route participation increase this season, and I think that'll correlate very strongly to fantasy production. And here's what I really love about Dotson. When he played, he was great. So I looked at the games that he played in, and I am including those games in the middle of the year where I think he might have come back a little too soon, but we're going to count them. So over 40% of his games, he scored at least 15 points last season. Again, only 12 games he played in. But then I asked myself, all right, how many wide receivers in the league last year scored 15 fantasy points in at least 40% of their games played? There's only 24 wide receivers in the league that fit that. So, I mean, if we're talking a typical 12-team league, right? That's a wide receiver 2 on a points per game basis scored. And now we can have a healthy Jahan Dotson, cross our fingers, where McLaurin now is hurt to start the year. He has been a hot topic around camp. Second year wide receivers, we absolutely love to target. Everything is just pointing up, up, up when it comes to Dotson, a guy you're going to want to target in your redraft leagues. And because of that, you're going to see some very strong, I think, dynasty appreciation over the course of this season. And the last guy I'm targeting at wide receiver is going to be Seattle rookie Jackson Smith Njigba, JSN for short. Now, I'm recording this on August 25th. If next weekend we find out that JSN is going to be on IR and miss the first 6 weeks of the season with that wrist injury, you can probably just fast forward and skip what I'm about to say here. But if we find out maybe he's only missing a week or two, which is what I think will happen, I'm still very much interested at where he is going, which is wide receiver 36 in redraft leagues. This is a guy who had a breakout age according to player profile below the age of 20. He's 99th percentile in agility score. Absolutely crushed his time at Ohio State in 2021 as a sophomore. Obviously, last year he only played 3 games due to a hamstring injury. But the previous season, he had 95 receptions, 1,600 yards. He had over 20% target share. He caught 85% of his passes, 9 touchdowns. He was an absolute just beast. I mean, he was the best wide receiver on that team, which also included Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. also was a young guy there at that time. And JSN, the camp reports have just been gushing all over this guy. He's making plays all over the field. And I'll tell you what, if somehow you don't come away with JSN, he kind of goes in the same range as Dotson. I would rather just take Jahan Dotson right now in the same range. And then if JSN is injured or struggles out of the gate, which is not uncommon for rookies, he becomes a very easy target for you in redraft leagues in that first 1 to 3 weeks of the season. Think Justin Jefferson, who I don't even think he could get on the field the first 2 weeks of the season, and then obviously he exploded when he did. So I think JSN is a great value at where he's currently going. His dynasty ranking is significantly higher than where he is ranked right now. From a redraft standpoint, interesting enough, he's actually ranked side by side with fellow Seattle receiver DK Metcalf at wide receiver 14, JSN at wide receiver 15. So there's a lot of long-term optimism. I think people recognize just how good this guy is. I think he will be a guy who can help you on the back half of the redraft season. He's clearly a guy that I think can win you leagues. So yeah, JSN, Dotson, Deontay Johnson, and Chris Godwin. I think you can kind of see a theme here from a redraft standpoint where I really love to hammer the mid-round wide receivers because I think there's just so much value with these guys and really trying to target more elite running backs, quarterbacks, and the top 2 tight ends earlier in draft and then find the value with these wide receivers in the middle. So pivoting to running backs, I have 2 running backs, both going later in redraft from where we were looking at with wide receivers. But the first one is another Commanders player, and that is Antonio Gibson, entering his 4th season in the league. Gibson right now, ADP of running back 35, right next to teammate Brian Robinson, who is running back 34. Both these guys going early to mid 8th round. And then from a dynasty standpoint, Gibson running back 40, again very close to Brian Robinson running back 37 in dynasty. Gibson only 25 years old. His first 3 seasons in the league, he's been far more productive and finished significantly higher than where he is currently ranked. Starting in 2020, his full PPR finishes 13, 12, and 27 last year. Again, this is a guy who now is ranked running back 35. He has 2 seasons inside the top 15, and last year running back 27. And look, the reason we love Gibson is simply because of targets and projecting targets. Right, he led the team in targets last year with 58 targets in 15 games played. J.D. McKissic also saw a pretty good number of targets. He had 40. Brian Robinson had 12. McKissic is gone. I think it's safe to assume Gibson will assume a good share of what McKissic got from a target standpoint. So I think with the arrival of Eric Bieniemy as the offensive coordinator, J.D. McKissic now leaving, there's a lot of discussion around training camp about Gibson even getting more involved as a wide receiver out of the backfield. I think if Gibson can stay healthy, which has been a problem for him, but if he can stay healthy, play 15, 16, 17 games, this is a guy who could come very close to getting 100 targets for Washington this year. That's pretty rare air, right? There was only 2 guys in the league last year for running backs that got over 100 targets. That was Austin Eckler and Christian McCaffrey. I'm certainly not saying he's going to be anywhere near those guys, but again, Gibson right now is going in the middle of the 8th round. He has significant value. I think this is a guy you should be targeting at least a round, maybe even a round and a half earlier, because the upside with the target volume he is likely to receive if he can stay healthy, I think is going to greatly outperform his current ADP. And then from a dynasty standpoint, this guy's a free agent. Right? He's produced every single year. I think he's going to produce again this year. He's going to be a free agent, and perhaps we can have kind of a free Antonio Gibson movement if he lands with the right team in the right situation where his snap count and everything else that comes with it, we could see a higher usage share for Gibson. So I think everything's kind of pointing up compared to where Gibson is currently going. I think it's all just upside right now with Gibson and a player you should be targeting. Currently valued early to middle 8th round, and again, take him about a round to a round and a half earlier. And then the last guy I want to mention is more of a handcuffed in a redraft league, and that's going to be Jaylen Warren. He's my favorite handcuff target, the backup for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he might even have some standalone value this season. Right now, he's running back 48th, middle to late 13th round, again, handcuff territory. And look, I think J.J. Zacharyason's done some good work on this, and he kind of advocates when it comes to handcuff running backs, don't target your handcuffs, target somebody else's handcuffs. So I'm definitely not drafting Najee Harris. I have very low exposure to Harris in either redraft or dynasty this season, but I have a lot of exposure to Jaylen Warren. He's one of my favorite handcuff targets from a dynasty standpoint. He still ranks pretty low, running back 48 under the age of 25. I think you're going to see some pretty solid appreciation this season with Jaylen Warren. And gosh, I wish I could remember who had this on Twitter, but I saw a tweet which was effectively like, this situation between Warren and Harris kind of screams a lot from 2 years ago with the situation with Tony Pollard and Zeke Elliott with the Cowboys. So Warren's one of my favorite late round targets. And just to illustrate a few points here, look, some of the advanced rushing numbers with Jaylen Warren were much better than Najee Harris last year, right? We can just simply look at yards per carry. Jaylen Warren averaged almost 5 yards a carry. Najee Harris was a pretty pedestrian 3.8. Yards before contact, much better for Warren, 2.3 to 1.3 for Harris. Warren even had a slightly better yards after contact per attempt at 2.6 to Harris's 2.5. Of course, he's a more adequate receiving back. His catch rate was at 85%. Harris was at 77%. Yards per route, 7.6 for Warren, 5.7 for Harris. So again, this is a pretty solid standalone value at this rate, and then he could quickly accelerate, I think, into running back 2 territory if Harris was to miss any significant time, or quite frankly, it's possible Warren could even start to outplay Harris and really cut into his usage. So Warren's my favorite handcuff target at the running back position this redraft season. And then 2 tight ends I like, both very young. One's a rookie. First one's going to be Luke Musgrave, second round tight end for the Packers. And then the other one is Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. Both these guys are well outside the top 20 in redraft rankings for tight end. Musgrave right now, tight end 25. Ferguson, tight end 27. So Kind of similar to my approach at the quarterback position in redraft leagues right now with tight end. If I can get one of the top 2 tight ends, that's my first strategy. So with Kelsey, if I have the 3rd or 4th pick and Kelsey's on the board, that's going to be my pick there. And then with Mark Andrews, I clearly tight end too. If I can get him middle to late 2nd round, that's a quick selection there. If I miss on both of those guys, I'm probably waiting pretty late, and I'm going to go heavy with a lot of these rookies. Sam Laporta obviously is included in that. The rookie Dalton Kincaid for the Bills, and then these 2 guys I like as well, Luke Musgrave and Jake Ferguson. I think they're going to inherit tight end 1 roles. Musgrave as a rookie, Jake Ferguson as a second year guy. On the Dynasty side, Musgrave is a little bit higher, being a rookie, tight end 15. Jake Ferguson, tight end 25. He's already seen a fair amount of appreciation over the last month or two as training camp has clearly, I think, cemented him as the tight end 1 in Dallas. And Ferguson is kind of like my favorite guy late in drafts right now. His advanced metrics on a very small sample size last year was really strong. His yards per route run was over 2.1. That was one of the best in the league for tight ends that had at least 300 snaps played. His targets per route run was over 25%, which is also pretty good. And then when you combine that with the fact that Dalton Schultz left via free agency, I think Jake Ferguson has already cemented his spot as the tight end 1. Consider what Schultz left behind: 791 snaps, 89 targets, 57 receptions, 5 touchdowns, 577 yards receiving. I mean, look at Ferguson's catch rate is ridiculous. It's 86%. Schultz was at 64% last season. So you're going to see Ferguson's role in this offense, his snaps played, his target amount, touchdowns, yardage, all that is going to start filtering his way compared to what Schultz had last year. I think he's going to greatly outperform his ADP, and I think he'll be a fringe tight end 1 on the season, a guy you can get very, very late in your draft, and a guy who's going to see some pretty sharp dynasty appreciation as well by the end of this season. So there you go. There's 10 guys that I am targeting in both dynasty leagues and redraft leagues. So make sure you hit subscribe. Thanks for listening to episode 3 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. If you like this series, make sure you hit subscribe. We'll cover more players who are in those other quadrants here in these upcoming episodes. Try and get all those out before next weekend's Labor Day draft season. So this is Dustin Chandry signing off. Thank you for listening to episode 3. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.